He built every wall he had out of his father's name, and I walked into his keep carrying the name that killed him. I was supposed to be a weapon, a daughter traded like a piece on a board. My father had been playing long before I understood the game. I arrived expecting an enemy, cold, unreachable, a man so sealed inside his own grief that nothing alive could get close enough to matter. What I found was something far more dangerous than an enemy. What I found was a man who hadn't let anyone close enough to hurt him in 5 years, and who was, without either of us meaning for it to happen, letting me in. Border reports left on my side of the table, a cup of tea placed without explanation, a hillside at dusk that he had never taken anyone to, silences that said more than any declaration could. I should have used it. That was what I was sent here for. Instead, I burned every letter my father asked me to write, every single one, because somewhere between the argument we never finished, and the laugh neither of us planned, and the night he sat beside me on a hill and said nothing, and it was enough I stopped being his enemy's daughter, and I became something I had never been before in my life, someone with something real to lose. And then his men found the letters I wrote before all of that, before I understood what I was walking into, before I understood what he was underneath all that armor, and I watched him go somewhere I couldn't reach. I could have let him believe it, let the evidence speak, walked away with my bloodline intact and my father's plan quietly completed. But I didn't. Because it's right. Because this is my home now, and I won't let him take it from me. This is the story of two people handed to each other by politics and grief who chose each other instead, through real and costly things, in the only way that actually lasts. This is the Alpha's forbidden bride. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Became a Wolf. The last thing Kael Draeven's father ever said to him was, "Don't let them see you cry." He hadn't understood it then. He was 17, standing in the doorway of his father's chamber with the smell of blood so thick it coated the back of his throat, watching the pack healers move around the bed with the slow, deliberate stillness of people who had already accepted what Kael refused to. His father's chest was rising, barely, each breath a wet, labored thing that sounded like paper tearing. Aldrich Draeven had been the most feared alpha in 3 generations, broad as a war horse, with hands that could splinter oak and a voice that silenced rooms before he'd spoken a full sentence. Kael had spent his entire childhood measuring himself against that shadow and finding himself perpetually small. He didn't feel small now, he felt hollow. The healer, Old Marin, who had delivered Kael into the world and never once looked rattled by anything, would not meet his eyes. That told him everything. He crossed the room, sat beside his father, took the large, cooling hand in both of his and held it the way he hadn't since he was a child, when nightmares still had the power to drive him down the corridor to his parents' room. Aldrich's eyes opened pale gray, same as Kael's, same as every Draeven male going back further than anyone bothered to count. "The Voss boy," his father said, not a question, a verdict. Kael didn't answer. There had been a meeting, disputed territory, words exchanged that crossed lines words weren't supposed to cross. His father had gone alone because he believed in the weight of his own presence as a deterrent. He had miscalculated, for the first and final time, who he was dealing with. "You'll want revenge." Aldrich's grip tightened, surprisingly fierce for a dying man. "Don't let it make you stupid." "Don't talk." "Kael," the name landed like a stone dropped in still water. "Don't let them see you cry." He understood it 3 hours later, standing before the assembled pack in the great hall with his father's body laid out behind him and 70 pairs of eyes searching his face for something to believe in. They were frightened. He could smell it, that sharp, metallic edge beneath the wood smoke and candle tallow, fear wearing the polite mask of grief. They didn't just need to be told their alpha was dead. They needed to be shown. Their next one was already standing. So he stood, spine straight, jaw set, hands loose at his sides. He spoke clearly and without trembling about what came next: border rotations, the war council, the funeral rites. He watched relief move through the crowd like a slow exhale and understood, with a clarity that felt like something closing inside his chest, what he had just agreed to become. He did not cry. Not then. Not in the weeks that followed, which blurred into each other in a procession of decisions and demonstrations, and the daily, grinding performance of being more certain than he actually was. Grief, he discovered, did not disappear when you refused it. It simply moved, settled somewhere deeper, calcified into something harder and less identifiable than sadness. It became the way he looked at people, measuring, watchful, always waiting for the angle. It became the silence he kept around himself like a second skin. It became the particular quality of his stillness in a room, the kind that made grown men choose their words carefully. The pack called it authority. Kael knew what it actually was. 5 years passed. The Ironvale pack grew in strength under his leadership, their borders holding firm, their enemies keeping a respectful distance. He was not beloved the way his father had been. He didn't want to be. Beloved men got close enough to be betrayed. He preferred the cold geometry of respect, clean, predictable, requiring nothing from him that he wasn't prepared to give. He had almost convinced himself that this was enough, that this narrow, armored version of living was simply what alphas were made of, and that the boy who used to run the hillside behind the keep with his father at dusk had never really existed at all. Then the letter arrived. He read it twice, set it down on his desk with the particular careful steadiness he used for things that made him want to put his fist through stone. The political language was elaborate, almost impressive in its convolution. Alliance, mutual benefit, historical tensions, lasting peace. Words arranged like flowers over a grave. What it said, stripped to its bones, was simple. He was to marry Seraphina Voss, daughter of the man his father had named with his last breath. And she was already 3 days' ride away. Chapter 2, The Wrong Kind of Enemy. She arrived on a gray morning, which felt appropriate. Kael watched from the upper corridor window as the Voss procession passed through the Ironvale gates, a modest column, 4 riders and a covered wagon, nothing that announced itself as important. He had expected banners, some performative display of the Voss name, a reminder that this arrangement had been their idea and they wanted credit for it. Instead, they rode in quietly, and that quiet unsettled him more than pageantry would have. The girl-woman, he corrected himself, though something in him resisted it, dismounted before anyone could assist her. Small detail. He filed it away. She stood in the courtyard and looked up at the keep the way soldiers looked at fortifications. Not with fear, with assessment. He moved downstairs. The great hall felt smaller than usual when he entered it, which made no sense because nothing about the room had changed. She was standing near the far window with her back partially turned, still in her riding clothes, dark hair pulled back with the kind of severe practicality that suggested she'd done it herself. Her escort hovered uncertainly behind her. She didn't appear to notice or care. When she turned and saw him, she didn't drop her gaze, didn't lower her chin, didn't perform any of the small physical apologies women in her position typically offered powerful men without realizing they were doing it. She simply looked at him, steady and direct, like she was waiting to see what he would do with the silence before she decided anything about him. Kael Draeven. Her voice was even, not warm, not cold, measured. "You're earlier than expected," he said. "We rode through the night." A pause. "I didn't see the point in delaying." Something about the way she said it suggested the delay she was referring to wasn't merely the journey. He studied her the way he studied everything, searching for the angle, the performance, the tell that would reveal what she actually was beneath whatever she'd been sent here to appear to be. She was composed, yes, but it wasn't the practiced composure of someone trained for court, that particular brand of smoothness that came from rehearsal. This was something different. This was a person who had learned stillness the hard way, from the inside out. He recognized it, uncomfortably, because he had learned it the same way. "You'll want to see your chambers," he said. In a moment, she glanced around the hall with that same assessing quality he'd noticed from the window. Her eyes moved to the Draeven banners, the mounted weapons, the old burn scar along the eastern wall that no one had ever fully explained to visitors. "Your hall is older than I expected. The eastern wall has fire damage." Old damage. The stone was repaired, but the banner above it is newer than the others. someone covered something deliberately. She looked back at him, and there was no accusation in it, just observation. You don't have to tell me what. I'm only nodding that I notice things. The silence that followed was a different kind than before. Is that a warning? He asked. It's an introduction. He didn't respond to that. Couldn't quite, in the way he normally dispatched unwanted conversation, with a coolness that communicated the subject was closed. She had said nothing aggressive, and yet he felt the ground had shifted slightly beneath him in a way he couldn't immediately map. Dinner that evening was its own particular form of combat. She asked pointed questions about Ironvale's border history that were too specific for casual curiosity, and when he said so, she told him flatly that she'd grown up listening to her father discuss those borders as though they were wounds that needed reopening. She hadn't agreed with him. She'd simply been in the room. You expect me to believe you have no loyalty to your father's agenda, Kael said. Her eyes met his across the table. Something moved through them, not hurt, not anger, but something older and quieter than either. I expect you to watch me, she said, and find out for yourself. He didn't sleep well that night. He told himself it was irritation. He almost believed it. Chapter 3, Spaces Between Duty. The first week was a negotiation conducted entirely in silence. They had established, without discussing it, a set of unspoken boundaries, rooms that belonged to him, hours that belonged to her, meals that were attended out of obligation and endured with the careful politeness of two people who had agreed, wordlessly, not to start anything they weren't prepared to finish. The pack watched. They always watched. Kael felt their attention like a low hum beneath every interaction, waiting to see which direction this would break. It didn't break. It simply wore thin in places. The first crack came on a Tuesday, over a bowl of cold broth that the kitchen had sent up late. Kael had been reviewing border reports at the head of the table when Seraphina sat down across from him uninvited, looked at the broth, and said without preamble, Your kitchen staff is either incompetent or sending you a message. He looked up slowly. Excuse me. This has been sitting for an hour. The fat has separated. She pulled the bowl toward her, examined it with the clinical detachment of someone who had clearly survived far worse meals, and pushed it back. In my father's house, the cook did it deliberately when he was displeased about something, usually wages. Kael stared at her for a moment. Then, against every intention, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. His name is Brennan. He's been with the pack 30 years and he's displeased that I replaced his assistant last month. Did the assistant deserve it? He was stealing salt. She considered this with genuine seriousness. Salt is expensive. That was essentially his argument. The laugh caught them both off guard, hers first, brief and unguarded, the kind that escapes before permission is granted. His followed a half-second behind, quieter, rusty from disuse. They both stopped almost immediately, as though the sound had startled them back to their senses, but the silence afterward was a different texture than the ones that had come before it. Something had been established. Neither named it. The days that followed moved differently, not warmly, not yet, but with less deliberate frost. She began appearing in the Great Hall during his morning meetings, not participating, simply present, listening with that focused quality he had noticed on her first day. He found he didn't mind, then found himself minding that he didn't mind. She asked him once, during an evening walk along the inner courtyard that had begun as coincidence and gradually become routine, how old he had been when he learned to read border maps. 9, he said. My father started me early. Mine too, a beat, though his reasons were different from what I suspect yours were. He didn't ask her to elaborate. She didn't offer to, but the parallel hung between them like smoke, acknowledged without being touched. It was 3 weeks into this careful, accumulating closeness that he went to the hillside. He hadn't planned to bring her. He hadn't planned to go himself. It was one of those evenings that simply pulled him in that direction, the sky doing something particular with the last of the light that it only did in late autumn, amber dissolving into a bruised and tender blue. He was through the keep's rear gate before he'd consciously decided to leave. He heard her footsteps behind him on the path and stopped walking. She stopped too. He didn't turn around, didn't tell her to go back, didn't explain where he was going or why, didn't offer her any of the social architecture that would have made the moment easier to navigate. He simply stood there for a long breath, looking at the hill ahead, and then kept walking. She followed, quietly, without asking a single thing. They sat at the crest as the last light left the sky, close enough that he could have counted her breaths, far enough that nothing was claimed. Below them, the Ironvale Keep glowed amber against the darkening valley. His father had loved this view, had said once that it was the only place where the weight of the pack felt like a privilege instead of a sentence. Kael said none of this. She didn't ask. And somehow, in the space between what wasn't said, something between them became irrevocable. Chapter 4, What the Silence Holds. He started leaving the border reports on her side of the table. Not with instruction or explanation, they simply appeared beside her morning tea, unrolled and waited at the corners as though they had always belonged there. She never commented on it. She read them with the same focused quiet she brought to everything, occasionally marking something in the margin with a fine, precise hand. He told himself it was practical. A second set of eyes, nothing more. He almost convinced himself. She had begun to move through the keep differently, less like a guest measuring exits, and more like someone who had quietly decided which corners belonged to her. She knew the kitchen staff by name now, all of them, including Brennan, who had apparently forgiven the salt incident entirely and had begun sending up her tea unprompted every morning at the same hour. She had rearranged 3 things in the great hall that had always bothered Kael without him ever articulating why. And when he noticed, the irritation he'd prepared dissolved before it fully formed. He was dismantling. He could feel it happening the way you feel a season changing, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small, unmistakable signs, and by the time you name it, it has already arrived. One evening, he told her about his father without intending to. They were sitting by the fire, the keep settled into its nighttime quiet around them, and she had asked about a name carved into the mantelpiece, A.D., with the idle curiosity she applied to the keep's small mysteries. He'd answered before the reflex to deflect could stop him. Said his father had carved it the year he became Alpha, said it was something Draeven men did, marking the stone of the keep the way trees marked their growth in rings. "Will you carve yours?" she asked. The question landed somewhere unguarded. He looked at the mantelpiece for a long moment. "I haven't decided if I've earned it yet." She didn't tell him he had. Didn't rush to fill the admission with reassurance the way most people did, that reflexive plastering over of vulnerability with empty comfort. She simply looked at him with those steady eyes and let the words exist in the room without dressing them. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for him in years. Seraphina felt it happening too, and it frightened her in ways she couldn't afford to examine directly. She had come here braced for hostility, had constructed herself accordingly, composed, watchful, giving nothing away that could be used. She had not prepared for warmth, had not prepared for a place that, against all logic and history, was beginning to feel like the first home she had ever genuinely wanted. That was the danger. Because she knew what her father had sent her here to do, had known since the morning of her departure, when he had pulled her aside and told her, with the particular gentleness he reserved for instructions that were actually ultimatums, what information he needed and how regularly he expected it delivered. She had said nothing then. Had ridden 3 days telling herself she would find a way around it, through it, some path that didn't require her to become what he had always been trying to make her. But every day she stayed, every border report and firelit evening and unguarded thing Kael said without realizing he was saying it, the cost of that path grew, and the cost of the other one grew alongside it. She was standing at a window late that night, long after the keep had gone quiet, when she heard his footsteps in the corridor slow outside her door. They stopped. A long pause, the kind that holds a decision inside it. Then they continued on. She pressed her hand, flat against the cold stone of the wall, and breathed. She had perhaps days before her father's messenger arrived expecting a response. The life she had built inside these walls, carefully and without meaning to, sat on the other side of whatever she decided next. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, soft and indifferent, covering everything it touched. By morning, nothing would look the same. Chapter 5, The Evidence. The messenger arrived with the snow. Kael was in the war room when Brennan brought him the sealed letter, not from the Voss territory, which would have been expected, but intercepted at the eastern border, tucked inside a trader's saddlebag with the particular care of something that was never meant to be found. His head of guard, Wren, stood opposite him with the flat expression of a man delivering news he wishes he could put down and walk away from. "There's more," Wren said. There was always more. The documents were laid out across the war table with grim precision, 3 intercepted letters in Seraphina's handwriting, detailed enough to be damning, specific enough to hollow him out completely. Border rotation schedules, supply routes, the names of 2 pack members who held positions sensitive enough that seeing them on paper, in her hand, in a letter addressed to her father, made the room feel suddenly airless. Kael read them once, twice, set them down. He stood very still for a long time. "Where is she?" he asked. His voice came out level, uninflected, the voice he used when the alternative was something he couldn't afford. "The eastern courtyard." He walked there without hurrying. She saw him coming and knew immediately. He watched the recognition move through her, not guilt, not the flinching scramble of someone caught, but something quieter and more devastating than either. A kind of grief that was already waiting for him to arrive. He stopped 3 feet from her and held out the letters. She looked at them, looked at him, took them with steady hands and read, and he watched her face as she watched something complicated and painful move through her eyes before they settled into that stillness he had once found remarkable and now couldn't read at all. She didn't say, "I can explain," didn't say it isn't what it looks like, didn't reach for any of the phrases that people reached for when they needed to buy themselves time inside someone else's trust. She said nothing. And he said nothing. That was the thing that wrecked it, not anger, not accusation, not the clean violence of a confrontation that at least would have given them something to push against. Just silence. Kael looking at her from somewhere that was already very far away, his gray eyes doing that thing she had only seen once before, on the night she'd asked about the mantelpiece carving going inward, going closed, the careful architecture of a man sealing something off before it could cost him further. She had done that to him. The understanding of it sat in her chest like a stone dropped in deep water, still sinking. "Kael." He turned and walked back inside. Not quickly, not with any visible emotion. Just the deliberate, measured exit of a man who had decided the conversation was finished, because continuing it would require him to feel something he had already buried once and refused to bury again. She stood in the snow for a long time after he'd gone. The cold didn't register. Neither did the sounds of the keep resuming around her, the guards changing rotation, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the ordinary machinery of a place that didn't know yet that something had just broken inside it. She held the letters in both hands and looked at her own handwriting and thought about her father sitting somewhere warm, satisfied, waiting for exactly this. She thought about the hillside, about the fire and the mantelpiece and the border reports waited at the corners left beside her morning tea, about the footsteps that had paused outside her door and then, in the end, walked on. She thought about what it meant that none of those things had been in any letter she'd written. The decision arrived not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of something that had always been inevitable, waiting only for her to stop being afraid of the cost. She folded her father's letters carefully, tucked them inside her coat. Then she went to find Wren. Chapter 6, She Chooses. Wren listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. She laid everything out for him in the small guard room off the eastern corridor, not just the intercepted letters, but the ones she had written and never sent, the ones she had written and burned, the full architecture of her father's plan as she understood it, which was completely, because he had never thought her worth the effort of concealment. She told Wren about the marriage being engineered, about the information requested, about the delivery system her father had established through the trader's route without her consent or participation. She placed the folded letters on the table between them and kept her hands flat beside them so they wouldn't tremble. "I need you to take me to him," she said. She didn't mean Ren. Kael was in his father's study when they arrived, the room he used when he needed to think inside stone walls thick enough to hold whatever he didn't say aloud. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, and he didn't turn when they entered, but she saw his shoulders register the sound of her footsteps specifically, a barely perceptible shift, like a man bracing. She didn't wait for him to face her. She told him everything. All of it from the morning of her departure, her father's hand on her arm, the gentleness that was never gentleness, the instructions delivered like a kindness. She told him about the 3 weeks of letters she had written and destroyed, about the night she had stood at her window with her hand pressed against cold stone, listening to his footsteps slow outside her door, understanding with terrible clarity what she stood to lose and what her silence was costing them both. She told him that the letters on his war table were real, her handwriting, her hand, and that she had written them during the first week, before the hillside, before the fire, before she had understood what kind of man he actually was beneath the armor he wore so constantly, he had probably forgotten it wasn't his skin. She told him she had stopped, that no information had left Ironville's walls, that she could prove it, and that Ren already had everything needed to dismantle her father's network at the border before nightfall. Kael turned from the window. He looked at her for a long time without speaking, that gray gaze moving over her face with the slow, careful attention of a man who had learned the hard way not to trust quickly and was now doing something that clearly cost him, looking anyway, choosing to look. She held his gaze and let him. "This will end your bloodline ties," he said finally. Not a question, not a deterrent, just the weight of it acknowledged. "I know. Your father will call it treason. I know that too." Another silence. Different from the one in the courtyard, this one had air in it, had the quality of something being decided rather than something already decided and merely delivered. "Why?" he asked. One word, stripped of everything except what it actually meant. She didn't dress it up, didn't reach for something impressive or safe. She looked at him the way she had looked at the Ironville keep on the morning she arrived, with complete honesty, measuring nothing, hiding nothing. "Because it's right," she said, "and because this is my home now, and I won't let him take it." By evening it was done. Ren's men moved through the border trading posts with the quiet efficiency of people who had been given precise information and knew exactly what to do with it. Her father's network collapsed in hours, years of careful construction undone in a single night by the daughter he had never once considered a threat. The war that had haunted 2 packs for a generation dissolved not with battle, but with exposure, the particular anticlimactic ending of conflicts built on secrets when the secrets were simply removed. Kael stood in the war room as the reports came in and said very little. But once, in the middle of it, he looked across the room to where Seraphina stood, still, composed, bearing the cost of what she'd done without asking anyone to acknowledge it, and something in his face changed. Not softened, opened. Like a door that had been sealed for 5 years deciding, quietly, that it was time. Chapter 7, What They Built in the Ruin. The keep was quiet, in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Not the tense, held breath quiet of a place waiting for something to break, but the deep, settled quiet of a place that had exhaled. Guards moved through their rotations without urgency. Fires burned in the hall without anyone watching them for signs. Somewhere in the lower corridor, 2 pack members were laughing about something ordinary, and the sound carried up through the stone the way ordinary sounds do when there is finally nothing louder competing with them. Kael stood in the war room long after everyone else had gone, the table still scattered with the evening's reports, confirmation after confirmation of a threat that no longer existed. He should have felt something clean. Victory had a particular smell, usually. Something sharp and satisfying that cut through the residue of tension like a blade through rope. He felt only the absence of noise, and underneath it a question. He found her on the hillside. He hadn't been certain that was where she'd be, but some part of him had known without reasoning it through, the same way he'd known things about her for weeks without wanting to admit the knowing. She was sitting exactly where they had sat together that first evening, same position, same view of the keep burning amber against the dark valley below. Except now she was alone, and the set of her shoulders told him everything the darkness tried to hide. He climbed the hill without announcing himself, sat down beside her in the cold grass without a word. She didn't startle, didn't wipe her face or straighten her spine or perform any of the small, dignified recoveries people attempted when they'd been found in grief and wanted to appear otherwise. She simply let him see her, red-eyed, quiet, present in her sadness the way she was present in everything, completely and without apology. They sat in silence for a long time. Below them, the valley breathed its cold night air, and the keep glowed on, indifferent and enduring, the way stone things outlasted the people who filled them with meaning. She was looking at it, but Kael understood she wasn't seeing it. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with a younger version of a man who had once, before power had finished its slow corruption of him, been capable of kindness to his daughter. The father she had spent a lifetime waiting to get back. The one she had buried tonight instead. He didn't speak, didn't reach for words that would reframe or comfort or redirect her toward the undeniable good of what she'd done. He had been on the receiving end of that particular kindness often enough to know it was not kindness at all. It was other people's discomfort with grief, dressed up as consolation. She didn't need that from him. So he simply stayed. The same way she had stayed, on this same hill, on an evening weeks ago when he had brought her somewhere sacred without explanation, and she had asked nothing, required nothing, simply existed beside him in the quiet and let him have whatever he needed to have in it. He felt her breathe beside him, felt the slight give of tension in her shoulders that meant she had registered, fully, that he wasn't going anywhere. After a while she said, quietly and without looking at him, "He used to call me his wolf girl, when I was small." A pause. The valley below held its breath. Before he decided I was more useful as a political instrument than a daughter. Kael said nothing, let the words exist. "I keep thinking about her," Seraphina said, "that little girl who believed him." The ache in her voice was the kind that didn't ask to be fixed. It asked only to be heard. "I know," he said, "just that." She turned and looked at him then, really looked, the way they had been looking at each other for weeks when they thought the other wasn't noticing. And in the particular honesty of that look, in the cold and the quiet and the amber glow of a keep that had somehow become hers, something settled between them that required no announcement. Not healed, not unburdened, not arriving at some luminous, uncomplicated happiness. Just two people who had chosen each other through real and costly things, sitting together on a hillside in the dark, whole in the only way that actually lasts.